George III was not born to be remembered for madness. He was once the golden hope of Britain. Born in 1738, he was the first Hanoverian monarch to speak English as his native tongue. Unlike his grandfather, George II, he cultivated an image of moral virtue, a king who valued family life over scandal. His marriage to Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was unusually faithful for a king of his time, producing 15 children. The people admired him as Farmer George, a monarch more interested in agriculture and science than in flamboyant courtly display. In the early years of his reign, George was respected as a steady hand, determined to reform government corruption and rule with moral strength. Yet behind the calm image lay an anxious, intensely conscientious man who would later be crushed by the weight of crown and country. The first great test of George's reign came from across the Atlantic. The American colonies had thrived for decades under relative independence, but Britain's growing debts from wars, including the costly 7 Years' War, forced Parliament to impose new taxes on its subjects. George, who believed deeply in the divine right of monarchy and the unity of the empire, refused to concede. His determination hardened with every rebellion. While the Americans declared no taxation without representation, George declared that Britain must never lose its authority. The American Revolution was not only a political crisis, but a personal wound to the king. When the colonies won independence, George was devastated. To him, it was not just a geopolitical defeat, it was a betrayal, a tearing away of part of his empire and his legacy. The man once hailed as strong and virtuous began to be haunted by doubts. By the 1780s, whispers began spreading in court. The king's behavior grew erratic. At times, he would speak endlessly without pause, his words racing as though his mind were on fire. He suffered fits of agitation, shouting, pacing, or convulsing in physical pain. Then, without warning, he would sink into silence, eyes distant, as though trapped inside his own mind. In 1788, his illness became undeniable. George collapsed into a state of delirium, rambling incoherently, trembling, sometimes foaming at the mouth. Physicians were baffled. Was it a disease of the body or of the mind? At a time when mental illness was seen as shameful, the court tried desperately to hide the truth. But the king's outbursts could not be concealed forever. The once dignified monarch now seemed like a man possessed. No one was more affected by George's illness than Queen Charlotte. She had once known her husband as a calm and gentle man, but now she lived in terror of his unpredictable moods. Witnesses described her shrinking away from him as he raged, screaming prayers or reciting nonsensical phrases. On darker days, he did not even recognize her or his children. The Queen, exhausted and humiliated, withdrew from him emotionally, creating a distance that pained George even further. Their once steady marriage became a tragedy. Two people bound together by duty, but separated by illness. To Charlotte, the palace was no longer a home. It had become a prison of whispers, doctors, and watchful servants. The king's madness was not only a medical crisis, it was a personal heartbreak, eroding the bonds of love and trust. The treatments George endured were almost as horrific as the illness itself. In an age before modern psychiatry, physicians used brutal methods, blistering the skin with hot irons, bleeding and purging. He was confined for long stretches, strapped to chairs or locked in darkened rooms to contain his outbursts. At times, he begged for mercy, pleading with his doctors to release him from pain. Yet the more he suffered, the more convinced they became that his madness required harsher discipline. What George endured was not simply an illness, it was torture disguised as medicine. His cries echoed through Windsor Castle, turning it from a royal residence into something more like an asylum. For the first time in English history, the crown itself seemed fragile, tied not to power or politics, but to the unstable mind of one man.
By the late 1780s, Parliament faced a crisis. If the king could not rule, who would govern? The answer was his son, George, the Prince of Wales, a man despised by many as frivolous, extravagant, and unfit for the crown. The Regency Bill proposed to grant the prince power, but fierce political debate erupted. To some, it was a betrayal to strip power from a living king. To others, it was necessary for the survival of government itself. During this political storm, the king's health briefly improved, allowing him to resume his role. But the shadow of instability lingered. His subjects now saw him as a fragile monarch, one illness away from collapse. The monarchy itself appeared vulnerable, at risk of tearing apart under the strain of personal tragedy and political maneuvering. Despite his illness, George remained deeply human and at times heartbreakingly lucid. There were moments when he spoke with clarity, expressing guilt and sorrow for his behavior. "I am not mad," he once said, "but I suffer as though I were." He tried to resume simple joys, walking in gardens, listening to music, or speaking with his daughters. These moments showed the man behind the crown, a father, a husband, a man longing for peace. But each recovery was temporary, followed by another relapse. His humanity made his suffering even more tragic. Unlike kings slain on battlefields, George was destroyed not by war or betrayal, but by the slow unraveling of his own mind. By the turn of the 19th century, George's illness grew worse. He became blind, partially deaf, and increasingly delusional. He would sometimes speak to his dead children as though they were alive, or pray aloud for hours without rest. By 1811, his condition had deteriorated so severely that Parliament declared his son, now Prince Regent, to rule in his stead. The once proud king became a prisoner in Windsor Castle, rarely seen by his subjects. He wandered the halls in confusion, dressed in rags, muttering to himself. The great monarch of empire, who once held the fate of nations in his hands, was reduced to a lonely, broken figure, forgotten even by those closest to him. George III died in 1820, after years of seclusion, a king in name but no longer in power. His death was met with a mixture of pity and relief. He had reigned for 60 decades, longer than any of his predecessors, but his legacy was overshadowed by madness and loss. To the British people, he became both a symbol of endurance and of fragility, a reminder that even kings are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. His reign marked both triumph and tragedy, the loss of America, the suffering of illness, and the survival of monarchy through his descendants. He was, in many ways, a king who embodied the contradictions of human life, both powerful and powerless, both revered and pitied. Today, George III is remembered less for his policies and more for his illness. Historians now believe he may have suffered from porphyria, a rare blood disorder, though others argue it was a psychiatric condition. Whatever the cause, his suffering reshaped how Britain understood monarchy itself. For centuries, kings were seen as untouchable, chosen by God. But George's madness made clear that even a sovereign was a fragile human being, subject to pain and weakness. His story is not only about politics, it is about compassion, misunderstanding, and the fear of mental illness in an age that could not comprehend it. The tale of George III reminds us that behind the crown lies a man, and behind the man lies a mind, sometimes noble, sometimes broken, but always human.